Hello, and thanks for joining today's session as part of the Budget Act at 100 virtual conference hosted by AABPA, ABFM, and NAPA. The topic of today's panel is disaster budgeting, how policy and a changing climate are straining how we pay for natural hazards. And it's my pleasure to be joined by three leading experts who work at the intersection of budgeting, public finance, disaster and resilience policy, and climate to contribute their insights to this week's events. I'm Colin Ford. I'm a manager with the Fiscal Federalism Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trust, and I'm very excited to be welcoming today's panelists, who I'll introduce shortly. Before I start, though, today's session has three primary goals. The first is to provide a big picture introduction to the complex ways that we pay for and budget for natural disasters across the federal, state, and local levels, and how that's evolved over time. Second is to highlight how that system is being strained in an era of more frequent, expensive, and severe disasters, with a focus on some of the intergovernmental challenges that is exacerbating. And third, and most importantly, to discuss and share some of the solutions being put forward by policymakers and the research community that could help manage these challenges into the future. As I said, we have a great and knowledgeable set of experts today who will start off the session with some framing remarks before we open it up to discussion. So first, we'll hear from Will Painter from the Congressional Research Service. In addition to Will's 10 years of experience with CRS, where he's a specialist in emergency management and homeland security policy, he has an extensive background on Capitol Hill, both as a professional staff on the House Appropriations Committee, as well as on the personal staff of the former chair and ranking member of that committee, working on issues like homeland security, defense, energy, and environment. And he's really one of the foremost experts on federal disaster budgeting practices. Next, we'll hear from Catherine Godfrey, an assistant director with the Government Accountability Office, or GAO. Catherine supports GAO's work on national preparedness, emergency management, critical infrastructure protection, and other Department of Homeland Security management issues. And in fact, Catherine joined GAO in 2003, just after DHS was created. She's contributed to studies on a range of Homeland Security related issues, and her work has focused a lot on national preparedness, including efforts to support disaster resilience and provide oversight of federal disaster expenditures. And rounding out our three presentations will be David Victor. David currently serves as a professor of industrial organization at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy, and is also the co-director of that university's Deep Carbonization Initiative. He's also a senior fellow at Brookings Institution, leading that group's work on energy and climate, and has an extensive background in climate, energy, and environment policy, having created and led the program on energy and sustainable development at Stanford University, as well as science and technology programs for the Council on Foreign Relations. After the three presentations, I'll also provide some brief information about Pew's research on this topic, particularly focusing on the state level. So with just 60 minutes to cover a lot of ground and hear a lot of information from these great experts, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Will. Will, over to you.
Thank you, Colin. Good morning or afternoon or evening, whenever you're watching this session. As Colin mentioned, my name is Will Painter, and I'm a specialist at the Congressional Research Service. In case you don't know about us, CRS is a part of the Library of Congress. We're a nonpartisan think tank that works solely for the US Congress, and we do not take positions on legislation, policy options, or administration actions. We just generally provide information. Today, I'll be quickly laying some groundwork for our discussion, focusing my attention on funding and budgeting for disaster declarations under the Stafford Act, the statute that frames the federalized emergency management system we have in the US. We have a lot of ground to cover, so pause me as needed. For those unfamiliar with the Stafford Act process, here's a simplified primer. The incident happens and the local government responds, and it calls for help from their state government if they need it. If the state is overwhelmed by the task, they call for help from the federal level by requesting a Stafford Act declaration. In the request, the state explains the situation and the type of help they need, and the president decides whether to issue a declaration of emergency or disaster for a specific set of counties or maybe even the entire state. And if he chooses to make the declaration, it outlines the types of assistance that will be made available. FEMA then works with the state to work out the details of the authorized aid, which is paid for from the Disaster Relief Fund, or DRF. Two quick notes. First, you can fill in territory or federally recognized Native American tribe for where I said state just now. It's just easier to roll it out if you say state. Second, not all assistance for Stafford Act disasters comes from the DRF. You're going to hear more about that later. This pattern of action seems old hat to many who work around disasters, but it's important to remember that the federal government has not always had a direct role in providing disaster assistance. Until 1947, federal involvement in disasters was ad hoc, and most disaster relief was non-governmental. This began to change after World War II, with the federal government providing war surplus as disaster assistance in 1947. The first appropriation for general disaster relief came a year later, $500,000 for farm-to-market roads. The Disaster Relief Act of 1950 set up the first formal authorization for a standing disaster relief program, formalizing the structure that had been included in those first appropriations. And the terms of that disaster relief program share some elements with what we have today. The state certifies the need for aid and has to commit resources to be eligible for federal help. The president determines that a disaster has occurred and that federal aid is required. Federal aid supplements the existing efforts and resources rather than replacing it. And in addition to providing money, the president may direct federal agencies to step in to help. Over the next 25 years, the General Disaster Relief Program gradually expanded under a series of reauthorizations. When catastrophic flooding, hurricanes, and earthquakes struck periodically, individual relief packages were developed for those specific events. Over time, the assistance provided in response to the specific catastrophic disasters became part of the more general disaster relief programs that stricken communities could pursue. The disaster relief program we know today stems from the Disaster Relief Act of 1974, which would go on to be renamed the Stafford Act in 1988. It continues to be amended, and Congress continues to modify and expand the system of general disaster relief. This brings us back to the DRF. This is the appropriation that started it all back in 1948. The DRF has received either an annual or supplemental appropriation almost every year since 1964. And this figure here shows the appropriations for the DRF from then through FY20. The volatility of the appropriation over this period of time makes scaling kind of a challenge, so we have the inset box to show the extremes. From the Katrina spike in FY05, Hurricane Sandy in FY13, the 2017 disaster series in FY17 and FY18, and the beginnings of COVID-19 in FY20. As you can see, the total appropriated has swung wildly, especially in recent years. So how do you budget for that? Next slide, please. Over the years, the methodology FEMA uses to make its annual appropriations request for the DRF has evolved a lot. It now uses a mixture of spending plans and rolling averages of certain costs. The largest single contributor to the request is the cost of prior year catastrophic disasters. Those are the ones that cost the DRF more than $500 million each. For FY22, FEMA anticipates the ongoing recovery cost to be more than $21 billion. In comparison, the projection for non-catastrophic disasters is around $2 billion. The big costs not captured in these calculations are those associated with new catastrophic disasters. Their scope and scale are seen as unpredictable. So FEMA's approach is usually to come back to Congress for more money in a supplemental appropriations bill if a catastrophic disaster hits. Some observers with concerns about the deficit or the overall volume of federal spending look at this situation and ask what sort of budget controls can effectively limit federal spending on disasters. Historically, our budget controls have included an emergency designation that specifically ensures funding for disaster relief remains available in a pinch. Congress rarely uses such emergency designations in annual appropriations, but uses them to make room in the budget for supplemental appropriations. Some observers note that the availability of this emergency designation drives Congress to treat virtually all disaster funding as emergencies, funding most of it through supplementals. In a report on supplemental appropriations in the 1990s, CBO observed that supplementals were being used more often, in part because in annual appropriations, administrations of both parties requested and Congress provided less than what would eventually be needed. Instead, they planned in advance to rely on supplemental appropriations that were designated as emergencies and therefore not counted against discretionary limits, leaving more room in the budget for other priorities. Even long-term disaster recovery costs for past disasters that are projected well in advance have been funded this way, at least until recently. Under the Budget Control Act, which was first applied in FY 2012, this pattern shifted. The costs of major disasters were eligible for their own special treatment, separate from emergency designations, but linked to the statutory discretionary spending caps. A congressional disaster relief designation allowed the caps to be adjusted upward a limited amount to make room for these costs. In the event additional assistance was required, the emergency designation could still be used to provide additional resources over and above that. Next slide, please. This figure gives an indication of the limited share of DRF spending that has scored against discretionary spending limits since FEMA was brought into DHS. The black shows what scored. The gold and blue show annual versus supplemental appropriations. And you can see after FY 2012, Congress used the disaster relief designation in the light green to ensure more DRF spending was provided in the annual appropriations bills rather than relying so much on supplementals. Next slide, please. This figure shows how the adjustment was used. While 93% of the adjustment was used for the DRF, you also see some of the other agencies that bring disaster to bear or bring assistance to bear for major disasters. Some observers considered this increase in the use of annual appropriations a good thing, as it made it easier to consider the costs of disasters in the context of the discretionary budget. However, this perspective allowed by the BCA has not prevented unprecedented amounts of disaster relief from flowing in recent years. FEMA projects that by the end of FY21, it will have obligated more than $160 billion from the DRF over 2 years, dwarfing any previous 2-year period in the DRF's history. Just a quick budgetary technical note, the special treatment for disaster relief expires at the end of FY21. The Biden administration has asked that similar flexibility be continued through a concurrent resolution on the FY22 budget. Now, the most direct means of controlling disaster spending would be to change the underlying laws that authorize disaster relief. Suggestions of relief limits or deductibles for states, larger non-federal cost shares, or changes in the declaration process are often met with reluctance by state governments. However, the trend over the 75-year history of the general disaster relief program is expansion of assistance, not limitation or reduction. I also want to leave you with a few other questions to consider. First, the current disaster relief system is a federalized one. Local and state governments are tasked with responding before the federal government serves as their backstop. How does the federal government ensure that state and local governments are adequately developing and maintaining their own disaster response capabilities rather than leaning on federal support? What is the proper balance, especially as costs are rising? Second, in the past year, we've seen an unprecedented use of Stafford Act authorities in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Of the $160 billion in obligations I mentioned above, more than $110 billion of that is projected to be for COVID-19 declarations. This is a novel application of the Stafford Act. Its major disaster authorities have never been used for a public health incident in the past. Let me point to one example of its novelty. Part of this expense was the Lost Wages Initiative, which was a novel application of the Other Needs Assistance Program, or ONA, last summer. In the course of 2 months, the administration obligated more than $41 billion through ONA for the program. ONA had obligated less than $7 billion over its entire 18-year lifespan up to that point. Will Congress keep the flexibility in the program that allowed so much money to be spent over such a limited amount of time without congressional say-so? How much of the broadened work under Stafford authorities for COVID-19 is going to be repeated in the future as part of a new standard for disaster assistance? Is this the new model for public health spending? Or will Congress reset the authorities of the Stafford Act to prevent such actions in the future? The central question may be this: does disaster relief represent enough of a priority for the federal government to maintain the status quo, notwithstanding its potential increase in costs? There's a lot to think about. Catherine, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Will. My name is Catherine Godfrey. I'm an assistant director at the Government Accountability Office, GAO, and like CRS, where Will is, we are a legislative branch agency. We conduct nonpartisan, non-ideological reviews of any area where federal money flows, and we usually do that by request of congressional committee or when we're mandated to do so in law. Can we have the first slide, please? So a few years back, as part of our budget and fiscal work, we identified major sources of federal fiscal exposure. Among those is the environment and disaster. A fiscal exposure, the definition is responsibilities, programs, and activities that may legally commit the federal government to future spending or create the expectation for future spending. Next slide, please. So the federal government has a couple of different roles and orientations towards disaster and climate. The first is that it is an insurer of property and crops. It has the National Flood Insurance and Crop Insurance subsidy programs that act as an alternative to direct federal assistance. And these programs were established to provide coverage where private market was not willing to bear the risk. And in the second case, the federal government provides funding to help communities prepare and respond. So these first two roles are where you see the fiscal exposure really come in. And you might have heard the phrase insurer of last resort. The federal government is the insurer of last resort. And in both of these, I've heard it applied in both of these contexts. And in both contexts, you know, there is some truth there. In the one case where the private market won't bear the risk, the federal government helps to subsidize. And in the other case, the federal government ends up providing disaster aid for uninsured or uninsurable losses. And the third role for the federal government is that it owns and operates infrastructure that can be vulnerable to climate-related disasters. So, for example, DOD's military assets, quite a bit of fiscal exposure to climate tied up there. The fourth role is as a convener of stakeholders. So in some cases, the federal government is uniquely situated to bring together stakeholders from across complex networks and enterprises to be able to help address problems, define problems, and bring solutions to bear. And the federal government can also play a role in packaging and distributing and helping to interpret both the data that it generates through its own programs and data from non-governmental organizations and the private sector. And it can provide that data in ways that help decision makers, both federal and non-federal, understand their risks and address them appropriately. So in these latter two roles, you'll notice that the federal government is situated as a sort of hub in the center of a complex network of actors and decision makers. And so if I do it right, by the end of my presentation, you'll understand why that's relevant. Next slide, please. So back in 2016, the appropriations committees asked us to identify all of the federal disaster assistance. And it specifically charged us to look beyond Stafford Act events and beyond the Disaster Relief Fund. And that turned out to be a pretty tricky task. So the estimate we came up with for the years 2005 through 2014 is at least $278 billion. In the end, there were categories that were so intertwined inside other budget lines that we couldn't necessarily find a way to estimate those. And so that's why I say at least, and that at least is, we know that this is not an underestimate or an overestimate. So it was a tough task to do this. We had quite a bit of work to do to define some of the terms, and did quite a bit of work over 17 departments and agencies. These are the 17 departments and agencies that have roles and responsibilities inside of the national frameworks, like the National Response Framework and the National Recovery Framework. And in some cases, as we can see from Will's presentation, it's easier to quantify when we're looking, straight at DRF and Stafford Act funding. And in other cases, there were funds that were spent inside of other budget line items, but were for disaster, and it was difficult to separate them out. Since this was a tough task, and thankfully no one has asked us to do it again since 2016. But over time, we've continued to use that estimate and then add annual appropriations and supplemental appropriations to keep a current estimate of what spending looks like. So not exact and a little bit of apples and oranges, but it gives us a pretty good idea of what's going on there. And so, of course, we had, as Will mentioned, some large disaster supplemental appropriations in 2017 and 2018 to deal with recovery from Hurricane Maria, among other large disasters. And so at this point, since 2004, using the method I just described, even when we don't include those large COVID-19 supplementals that Will discussed, we're at nearly $500 billion. And so at the end of the day, what does all this mean? It means that no matter how we do it, there is some judgment involved in estimating disaster spending, and we might not be able to get to a precise number, but we know that it's big, and we know that if nothing changes between the rising value of property and infrastructure, the tendency of humans to locate near disaster hazards, and the climate projections that we see for the coming increase in frequency and intensity of disaster, it's likely to get a lot bigger. Next slide, please. So being from GAO, my lens is the effective, efficient, and accountable government, mostly federal programs. And there are a few different ways to approach that. So the first is the sort of traditional auditing paradigm. So of course, we don't want things like improper payments or poorly designed and executed recovery programs. And we at GAO and the Inspector Generals and state level auditing shops have focused on this kind of auditing and evaluation for a long time, and will continue to do so. This is a core function of the accountability community. And in this paradigm, we largely ask retrospective questions like, how did the program perform? And then we identify deficiencies and make recommendations to address them by, for example, strengthening internal controls or implementing better risk management practices. So although all recommendations that we make are aimed to address future problems, we can't go back. We don't have a time machine. Nevertheless, this is a more reactive approach in that it's targeted towards preventing what has already happened from happening again. So at the same time, as the 21st century rolls on, we increasingly encounter more complicated problems where the enterprise around which we want to reduce risk is incredibly complex. Authority, resources, decision-making are all diffuse and often outside the direct control of federal programs, especially any one federal program. So one such problem is addressing the human cost and fiscal exposure that lies at the intersection of federal disaster policy and what the scientists tell us to expect, which is increasing intensity and frequency of disasters. So the inherent fragmentation of authority and decision-making complicates the exercise of accountability, and we need tools and approaches to evaluate complex and uncertain problems from a whole systems perspective. And given the gravity and the cost of human lives and livelihood, as well as the federal fiscal exposure, we want those approaches to allow us to exercise not just oversight, but also insight and foresight. So I'm going to talk about a couple of pieces of work at GAO that fall into that bucket. Next slide, please. So first is GAO has a high-risk list where every 2 years we report on federal programs and operations that are vulnerable to waste, fraud, and abuse and mismanagement. And as in the case of this issue of climate change, issues that need broad-based reforms. So the Managing Climate Risk High-Risk entry to GAO's high-risk list encapsulates a whole body of work and crosses multiple GAO areas, and it has a host of underlying recommendations. And I want to call attention to a couple that are particularly relevant for today's discussion. So on the slide, you'll see that we have asked the federal government to lead the development of a national climate strategic plan, establish an entity to prioritize national scale climate resilience projects, develop national climate information system, and make structural changes to the flood and crop insurance programs, as well as start thinking about, how are we going to manage planned migration due to climate, which we're starting to see in certain areas of the U.S. Adjacent to some of those things and very budget-specific recommendations that we've made in the past, in 2003, we recommended that OMB adopt budgeting and forecasting procedures to account for fiscal exposures such as major disaster costs as part of the federal budget process. That none of these recommendations have currently been implemented. I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So in 2011, we recommended that the federal government develop a strategic plan for climate adaptation that articulates roles for federal agencies as well as state and local governments. In 2017, we recommended that the Executive Office of the President identify significant climate risks facing the federal government and craft appropriate federal responses. And we have also recommended that as the OMB prepares any of the future climate change funding reports that we've recommended, that it also include costs for disaster assistance programs. Okay, next slide, please. So if you notice, the actions I discussed related to the high-risk list are largely broad, strategic, federally driven actions designed to facilitate climate adaptation actions. So if we think about solving the accountability problem that I defined previously, and that is evaluating from a whole systems perspective across a fragmented enterprise, we need these kinds of strategic approaches. And at the same time, another important piece of the puzzle is mainstreaming disaster risk reduction actions into other kinds of operations, initiatives, and risk management approaches. So enter GAO's disaster resilience framework. This framework has its origins dating all the way back to 2015 in internal discussions that we had connecting groups that, we hope will be connected out in the world, and certainly got connected at GAO across people interested in disaster recovery, federal budgeting, climate change, insurance, intergovernmental relations, among other big areas. And so as we started to recognize the complexity of this particular challenge, we started asking ourselves, what would happen if the federal government was firing on all cylinders anywhere that it touched a non-federal decision maker with the potential to influence investment in disaster risk reduction? And so we worked on that for a while, and then we had some, work with external experts in these areas, and ultimately we published the Disaster Resilience Framework, which just organizes a way of thinking about, again, what does it look like if the federal government does everything that it can, where appropriate, to promote disaster risk reduction. So in addition to calling for the kind of broad strategic action that I already discussed in the context of the high-risk list, the framework also offers an opportunity to think through whether there are relatively low cost, maybe not always, depending on the context, but targeted and contained actions that federal agencies can take as they carry out their other operations, other programs. An example of this might be adjusting a grant or a cooperative agreement so that it includes or prioritizes or otherwise promotes resilience investments along with its other policy aims. And so the framework, is targeted at the federal government. We hope eventually to help state audit institutions start thinking this way too, but it is targeted at actions that the federal government can take, but actions that affect the whole enterprise. And the federal government has policy tools and financial tools and takes some direct action, all ways of influencing and promoting disaster risk reduction decisions. The framework itself is organized around 3 separate principles. One is information, and the information principle really just is about what are those actions that the federal government can take that would help all of these decision makers, the private sector, state, locals, understand what their risk is, what does it look like now and in the future. So there's a piece of interpreting complex climate projection data in there, and then apply it to help identify what are the appropriate risk reduction strategies. The second principle is integration, and under the integration principle, we have a variety of different kinds of integration. The first is at the highest strategic level, we want to see this climate strategy that we recommended, but we also want to see resilience in all of the other places that it probably belongs, like national security strategies. And so the second piece of integration is really bringing together the federal programs so that they make sense and are cogently experienced for the non-federal partners who need to use them to help build disaster resilience. Those 17 departments and agencies who have disaster roles, they all touch different places inside of state government constructs. And so you've got your emergency management, homeland security departments, don't always connect to the housing department where they might be involved in disaster recovery, or transportation involved in disaster recovery and disaster resilience. So we want to see all of those things come together so that instead of, the money flows out of the federal cap and somebody puts their thumb on it, it sprays out all over the place, and it's not a very coordinated and coherent risk reduction strategy. And the final piece of that integration is just thinking about the relationships between different parts of infrastructure, different regions, and the interaction between natural systems and ecosystems and the built environment in ways that are reinforcing to reduce disaster risk. And the third principle is incentives. Incentives really is just about looking for the right incentives and aligning them in ways that make risk reduction more attractive among competing priorities. Often at the state and local level, it can be a difficult sell to pay for something today where the benefit is uncertain and may not be realized for some time. So, thinking about what it is we can do to help address that issue, and also to remove disincentives, and one of them lies back in the integration principle, where when federal programs are really difficult to navigate across different timelines and rules and regulations, sometimes that makes it more difficult for state and local governments to use, and they will not pursue disaster resilience where they otherwise might because of those administrative difficulties. So that is the end of my presentation, and I am going to turn it over to David.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you, Colin, for hosting this. It's a pleasure to be on the same virtual stage with Will and Catherine, because the work that I'm going to talk about has relied so heavily on the terrific work that's been done at CRS and at GAO. So I'm going to talk today, if we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk today about federal responses to climate-related perils. And so it's very hard to attribute any individual event to climate change, but we know something about the shift in the statistical probabilities of various kinds of extreme weather events in a world of climate change. And so we're trying to grapple with that question. What does it mean for the federal budget? What does it mean for the incentives for private deployment, state and local deployment structure, and so on? We go to the next slide. I'm going to speak today about work that's been done with folks at Brookings Institution, anchored in industry and academia, that's been looking not so much at the federal budget initially, but at the financial markets. What do the financial markets know about climate change, in particular on the physical risks associated with climate change? our kind of working hypothesis is that there's been a lot of talk about how the financial markets could see instabilities from what's called transition risk, shifting from high carbon industries to low carbon industries. Think oil and gas companies whose very quickly their business has to change and their valuations get destroyed. And so then their financial instability as a result of that. But most central bankers and most regulators have been focused on that issue. We think actually the bigger concerns are around physical risks, and that's because when it comes to physical risks, the markets don't know very much about those, whereas the markets actually know a lot about oil and gas companies produce oil and gas, and when you burn oil and gas, it produces emissions. Same is true for coal companies, same is true for a variety of other activities, whereas the kinds of companies that are exposed to physical risks and the kinds of infrastructures that are exposed to physical risks, in particular infrastructures that are financed at the state and local level, which is 3/4 of U.S. infrastructure spending, that those risks are very substantial indeed, and the markets know essentially nothing about that. So if we go to the next slide, the first paper that we put out coming from this work was called Flying Blind. There's a little summary of it here, and it's on our website. There's a link there, and there's also a markets at risk page on the Brookings website that has all the stuff that we've been doing on these kinds of questions. First paper just looked at that question empirically. What do the markets know about the physical risks of climate change? And in particular, in the area of municipal debt, there is this amazing disconnect between the municipalities that are exposed to the impacts of climate change and what they tell the markets when they go out and borrow. And that for us was really quite striking, because that's the area where, in some sense, these assets that are physically bolted to the ground are particularly vulnerable to climate-related impacts, because if climate change makes an area uninhabitable, for example, extreme heat events literally make some areas uninhabitable, which is in fact expected over the coming century. And there's been some science, quite a lot of science done in this area to look at the overall economic impacts of climate change, physical impacts of climate change, county by county around the country, and now in effect globally. If those counties lose population and lose productivity, then their tax base erodes, and then their capacity to repay debt erodes as well. So that's the logic from a private markets point of view, private money going into these kinds of instruments, and why you would want to have better disclosure. That's a topic the SEC is working on right now, and why you'd want to have better understanding of that. But here's the rub, which is we went out, we found no relationship between the exposure to the impacts of climate change and what these municipalities were telling the markets. And so we went out and we talked to credit rating agencies in particular and said, why is that? Because that seems odd, and why aren't you rating these debt instruments differently? And the answer almost everywhere was, part of it is we don't really know, and a lot of it is we assume that if something really bad happens, that the government, in particular the federal government, will step in. And you've heard the budget implications of this already from the previous two speakers. And so we really focused on that to look at the question of whether indeed federal programs are making things worse. And so if we go to the next slide, the paper that came out from this work came out in March of 2021. And the paper does a lot of things. What I want to do is just zoom in on two aspects of the paper that I think are particularly interesting for the discussion today. And the question in front of us is indeed, are federal programs making things worse? And are they creating, as the economists like to say, a moral hazard, perverse incentives that invite people to go do dangerous things, or at least insulate them from the consequences, at least partially, of doing dangerous things? And if that's, to the extent that's true, then in effect what's happening is that the damage function from the impacts of climate change in the United States, that damage function is moved closer to the origin and made steeper, which is a fancy way of saying that we're exposing the country to greater damages, because there's a very, very strong result in almost all the climate science in this area, which is that preparing for most impacts of climate change can radically reduce those impacts over time. Can't eliminate them, and in some cases you can't really prepare very well, but the difference between kind of smart preparedness, resilience if you like, and just sitting there and not doing anything, and then suddenly climate change impacts hit you, the difference in the cost to the society and anguish and so on is massive, massive indeed. So we set out to do something that turns out to be essentially impossible to do. And Catherine alluded to the difficulties that GAO has had with similar tasks. But I want to give you a conceptual framework of the core thing that we did in this paper, which will begin on the next slide. And what we've tried to do here is look at the difference between in the rows here between what might be called recovery, build back the same, programs that keep people whole, let them rebuild a house in an area that's been damaged, insure them against the consequences of that damage and so on, versus resilience, which is shown in the next row, which is helping to make societies better capable of managing the impacts that are plausibly going to be related to climate change and currently are related to various kinds of disasters and natural hazards. And then in the vertical, in the columns, we're looking at federal programs in 3 broad categories. Programs related to disaster response, programs related to infrastructure building and the maintenance of infrastructures, and programs related to subsidized insurance, flood, and crop in particular. So that's the conceptual framework that we're using in this paper. And what we wanted to do was just go off and probe the question that we had learned about from people in the marketplace, that federal programs were disproportionately designed to basically build back the same, to do recovery as opposed to resilience. And to the extent that that's true, then a whole set of questions around policy reform strategies and so on that both Will and Catherine talked about, and I'll talk about, a whole set of questions then follow from that. So we're going to try and organize the entire federal budget into these boxes, which is not how the federal budget is organized. And so therefore there are a lot of caveats associated with it, and the paper reports on those caveats in different accounting systems and so on. I'm going to wave a magic wand over all of that and just show you top level results from the work that we did. So if we go to the next slide, this slide shows 2 things. One is on the left in very small type so that you can't actually see the names of all the different programs and disagree with us. Different programs that we've assigned to different boxes. And there's a lot of bleed over. Catherine made that point, extremely important point. The methods are really hard in this area. But the bulk of the spending is on the first column, is related to disaster response. And the bulk of that spending is in the upper left-hand corner, which is recovery. So build back the same with approximation. We've then gone across and looked at disaster response, at infrastructure. Numerically, actually, the infrastructure programs are bigger because you can spend a whole lot of money on infrastructure. And remember, we're just looking at the federal budget here, and most public infrastructure is actually paid for at the state and local level. And so these where plausibly the kinds of problems about moral hazard that we're talking about in the federal budget are actually bigger, but that's a discussion for another day. And then the insurance programs. And when you put it all together, which is what we show on the right-hand side, when you put it all together, you see something on the order of a 7-to-1 imbalance, if you like. And that number might be as low as 3-to-1, it might be as high as 40-to-1. There are a variety of different ways of doing this. We've learned a huge amount from FEMA and from CRS and from GAO and their work and others work in this area. So there's this big imbalance, and that leads one to a conclusion, but an observation that there could be pretty substantial moral hazard issues. And then the paper goes through that in a more granular way. I'm not going to talk about that in more detail today. The other major empirical observation that comes from the paper, I'm going to show on the next slide. And what the next slide shows you is the relationship between one of those studies that I mentioned earlier, the new science, the county level science, and actually the best science is now even finer grained than county level. The relationship between county level losses due to climate change, which is the horizontal axis, logarithmic axis, and the vertical axis is the annual FEMA obligations and the PA program obligations for a decade from the year 2010 to the year 2020. And what we're trying to do is look at the relationship, so whether there's any relationship in terms of directionality, and it's mostly a cloud of data points with maybe a little bit of an upward sloping relationship, which is what you'd expect. Places that are going to be most vulnerable to climate change are probably already today experiencing more climate-related disasters. Not all FEMA disasters are climate-related. Very important point, but the bulk of the spending is, at least when you remove what's happened with the pandemic-related spending over the last year or so. But the other thing that's interesting is that 2 axes are not the same. So although we're comparing apples and oranges here to some degree, because the vertical axis is looking at things that are actually disasters and declared disasters, and the horizontal axis is looking at total economic loss, there is 2 to 3 orders of magnitude difference between the two. And this is part of our concern, is when you look out into the future, it's plausible that the kinds of unusual levels of disaster spending that we've seen in the last decade or so, in fact, are the beginning of what will become more and more unusual over time, and the climate system is science is broadly consistent with that. So we spent some time in the paper working that through. I think it's, at this point, you can't really nail down what will be the size of future disasters, because so much depends not only on what the actual physical impacts are of climate change, but how they're manifest, what becomes declared a disaster, and so on. But we've raised numerically a warning sign around that. I want to just show you a couple more slides before I stop. One of the things we did in the paper is we went through a conceptual exercise where we looked at the horizontal axis here. It's a little bit cut off on what's shown on the screen, but the horizontal axis here is the political difficulty of engaging in a reform that would make programs have less of this moral hazard. And we've looked at lots of different reforms, some of them real reforms, which are shown in the boxes, and some of them contemplated reforms, things that everybody talks about but doesn't do, which are shown in the ovals. And then the vertical axis is the amount of moral hazard left over after you do the reform. So, for example, there've been a few, not many, because although the political difficulty is relatively low, the budget costs are very high, and so that doesn't happen very often. A few towns that are fully relocated. If somebody thinks that they can locate assets in a town, and then if things go bad, they're going to be fully relocated, then that is in effect almost a perfect moral hazard. It does not cause the internalization of risk management to the actors that are most capable of internalizing that risk management. What you'd ideally like are reforms that are in the lower left-hand corner. Political difficulties are low, residual moral hazard after they're over is low or zero. There's not a lot in the lower left-hand corner. A few examples. The BRIC program, we're very enthusiastic about it. We're thrilled to see the new executive order in this area. It's moving in the right direction. And so a lot of people know what needs to be done, but the political difficulties of doing that, witness what we've just seen in the last few months with regard to reform on flood insurance maps and flood insurance pricing and so on. Political difficulties are very extreme. And that's not news, but we now, I think, have an additional set of data and analysis that make it possible to stare at the problem and identify ways of dealing with it. We wrote an op-ed in the middle of last month, the middle of May, in the New York Times on this question, and that seems to have gotten a very good attention. And it's not, there are no villains here in some sense. People know what to do, but the politics are really difficult. And there are a variety of strategies for making the politics better, and that's what I'm going to focus on my very last slide, which are some opportunities for doing better. One of the things we emphasized in that op-ed was to learn from the experience with doing other things that everyone agrees is a good idea, or almost everyone agrees is a good idea, but is politically hard because the costs are incident in different congressional districts, which is the base realignment and closing commission, the BRAC process. And we advocate putting together a similar kind of commission, which can put together package deals of disaster-related reforms and link them together as a package so that you don't end up with a lot of piecemeal activities, each of which is easy to pick off by whichever member of Congress or senator finds them contrary to their interests. There are a lot of ideas that we lay out in the paper. I just want to emphasize a couple that are I think going to be quite important. One of them is around infrastructure audits, so that in addition to better federal program spending, municipalities, state and local governments have a better sense of what's really at stake. There's a lot of potential for regulatory reform, notably at FEMA, and I think one of the things that's really impressive is everyone at FEMA knows that, and they're ready to go. The executive order is plausibly evidence that people are indeed moving in that direction. I think there's also a lot of unknowns in this area, and so one of the things we advocate in the paper is a more experimental standard setting, more active search by state and local governments along with the federal government to explore places where new strategies can be adopted. We can test new ideas and then learn from those experiments. And then I'll close by saying something about the National Climate Assessment. We do every few years a big assessment in the United States on impacts of climate change. Right now, we look at essentially none of the issues that are being discussed on this panel are part of the National Climate Assessment. So we think about the climate assessment program from the point of view of climate science, and not from the point of view of how society responds to the physical impacts of climate change that the climate scientists are telling us about. One of the lessons I think when you look across all three of these presentations today is that the way government responds is going to potentially have a massive impact on the actual damages of society and the fragileness or resilience of our society, and we need to do a better job of bringing that into these assessments. And with that, I'm going to stop and hand the floor back to Colin.
All right, well, thanks all, and thanks, David, for handing it off. I think that all those presentations give us a lot to think about. And before we jump into, I think, maybe just one question, I did want to highlight some of Pew's research in this area that I think ties really closely with what people are saying today, and maybe fills in a little bit about the state level, which we haven't heard addressed too specifically yet. So specifically what Pew has been trying to do in this area is really fill where possible a data gap, and where not possible to highlight the data gap about what states are doing in this area. So if we think about the role of the state in particular, you can think about state spending in two different ways. So first, on those smaller disasters that don't trigger a federal declaration, and second, on those cost shares and matching requirements that most of the big disaster spending programs have. So when we're thinking about this shifting landscape of climate disasters, different thinking from the federal level about how we're going to pay for these things, it really does make us ask what it means for states. And if you'll go to the next slide, I think what our research has found is that's a really hard question to answer. And one reason for that is that most states don't comprehensively track what they're spending on disasters, which, like at the federal level, can be spread across a lot of agencies and a lot of activities across the life cycle of a disaster. But we did go out and collect data about state spending from state emergency management agencies, and found that state spending varies widely. And that means that there are different implications for every state if we're thinking about changing how we pay for disaster costs and where they fit into those changes. So those findings have led us to recommend that states focus on improving the way that they track those expenditures. And as others have said, that can be a very difficult task. But the eye should really be towards figuring out how those resources could be more strategically allocated in ways that could help manage costs in the long term. So one way that we put that is, in this context, you can't manage what you don't track. So in terms of that sort of ratio of recovery to resilience that David was talking about, if you don't have a baseline, how can you, start working to improve it? So if you go to the next slide quickly, a few states like North Carolina and Ohio, and I would also mention Virginia and Colorado, have implemented policies to improve on their tracking, which we think is a really encouraging step and a really important piece of this puzzle. Next slide. So I will just highlight quickly that we've also done a 50-state look at the tools that states use to budget for disaster costs. As we know, states, unlike the federal government, need to balance their revenue and spending. We found that those tools are commonly used. So 5 of them are commonly used, and we categorize them as preemptive, meaning that they allow states to put aside money before disaster happens; responsive, meaning that they allow states to move money around during or after an event; or variable, which means it depends on the state or the situation. But the big takeaway there is that while states share a lot of the same tools, the way they apply them looks very different on the ground. And in this broader context that we're all talking about today, state budgeters should really be thinking strategically about how they're currently applying these tools, and really whether they're meeting the emerging needs that states are facing or that they may face down the road. And finally, if we'll just go to the next slide, part of what's so important about understanding how state resources are being used towards disasters is to help identify, ways to invest ahead of time in more cost-saving mitigation activities, which we've done an analysis using data from the National Institute of Building Sciences to show that those savings occur in every state. So, the long story short, from me is that states really are a critical piece to this puzzle, and the challenges that we're talking about require action, at all levels of government, federal, state, and local, if we're going to make progress. So at this point, we'll transition with the time remaining, which I don't believe is very much, to the discussion. If everybody can hop back on. And I think what I'll start by asking is, really bringing this up to the moment. And David alluded to some of this, but we've seen a kind of a slew of actions in the last few months around climate readiness, resilience, mitigation, the executive order that David mentioned, plus elements of the American Jobs Plan and the FY22 budget. So what does that all kind of mean in terms of the context of what we've been talking about today? And anybody can take a stab at that.
I'll say very briefly. I think there are two things going on. One is the pie is getting a lot bigger, so there's just a lot more money. Well, I would say it's not yet real money. There's a lot more imaginary money sloshing around the federal budget, and so that makes it easier to lift all boats, and especially boats that get favored. And the other thing that's going on is you've got an administration that is very focused on climate as one of the central organizing principles. But I think what's really interesting in all this, now, who knows how much of this is going to stick, and that's all familiar. To me, what's interesting is the climate debate used to be a debate that was synonymous with transition from high emissions to low emissions, and that's happening. That's a discussion, and that's the core of the plan, the nationally determined contribution that was laid out at the Earth Day summit that the president held. But this administration knows that they got to do something on the impact side, and they got to do something about differential impacts in different communities. They got to do something about the reality that even if you turn the ship very quickly, and we're not going to globally, climate warming is accelerating. We're 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The curves are bending up faster. We're going to blow through, we published a paper 2 years ago suggesting we're going to blow through 1.5 degrees, possibly by the late 2020s, not 2040, but in 5 or 6 years potentially. So that means you got to deal with the impacts.
One of the things that that is kind of a shift, and I've seen it mentioned. I saw it mentioned on one of David's slides, is the BRIC program and what's being done in terms of this new mitigation program. How this unfolds over the next few years is going to be very interesting. There's the way that the law is set up. You have a set aside of funding that basically comes directly out of the DRF to actually pay for specifically for these mitigation efforts. One of the things that has been added into the president's budget request isn't just taking existing money out of the DRF and placing it toward these things. They're actually requesting an additional $500 million on top of that. So they're taking that out of the discretionary side. So that little black bar for FY 2022, if it gets enacted, it's going to be a little bit bigger. But we're still talking about a relatively small amount given the need that that states and local governments will express for mitigation projects. Just how in the current political environment and in the current fiscal environment, how state and local governments will choose to interact with this program, how they will come up with local matches when their economies may be dealing with COVID impacts. It's going to be interesting to see how it unfolds over the next 24 months. And as there's a question of how much time we actually have to see how things unfold before we look at taking our next steps.
Yeah, I agree with those comments about BRIC. I mean, one thing that we have been, we've been really interested in the implementation of BRIC and the fact that some people talk about it as a replacement for PDM, and heard this phrase PDM on steroids, which is what we don't want to see. I think some of the problems in the past with the pre-disaster mitigation program is that it favored planning over funding projects, and there's a couple of different problems there. One of them being the communities that have that when you bring equity into the equation, the communities that have a better capacity for planning get more of the funding, and the other obviously being that once you've planned projects ad infinitum, you know, it's time to act. And I think we've heard that in conducting some of our audit work and interviewing state officials in the state emergency management functions is we know what we need to do, but we don't know how to marshal the funds to be able to do it. BRIC offers the opportunity in that it is more money to be able to address that problem. And at the same time, one of the things that we've been concerned about overall with all of the hazard mitigation programs, particularly the pre-disaster mitigation, is that the funding is spread so thin across the nation. And I was interested to see where it fell on your axis, David, of political problems, because I think it does have some political problems in that, you know, there's a lot of pressure to use a formula kind of grant and make sure everybody gets a piece of the pie. And so what we've talked to FEMA about related to BRIC is, you know, think about the methodologies that you're going to use to identify those national and regional risks that can't be addressed through the way the existing system works. And how, you know, how are you going to implement that to change the problems of the past? Because spending more money the same way is not going to result in what we are all hoping for.
Yeah, and this next question may put us over time, but oh well. I think because we've been talking, you know, very big picture about, you know, how these whole systems work, but thinking about, you know, somebody in the audience, you know, working on in a budget office or in financial management. I mean, what's something that they can take away to start raising awareness, you know, in their world about some of the issues that we've been talking about?
I mean, I think one thing is the cost of non-action, right? I mean, I think reorienting and thinking about the life of the investment in any kind of infrastructure and what you expect, and aligning that with climate projections, and just a new orientation to how you apply discount rate, project value over time.
I'll just jump in and say, I would urge everybody to just go through the exercise of asking yourself, which of these programs create the right private incentives? So they do the moral thing of helping, you know, people recover in time of need and things like that, but they also create the right longer term private incentives, because so much of what we're talking about in effect are federal programs and state programs and local programs, and in various ways alter private sector behavior that often magnifies that tenfold, hundredfold more some areas of the economy. So ask yourself, which of these programs create the most perverse private incentives, and which of these programs, and what is the magnitude of those incentives? And then you really, that's your list. That's where you start. That's where you're most concerned. It may be hard. I think what Catherine said was very astute, which is we made that conceptual diagram, and then every time somebody looks at their thing on the conceptual diagram, say, oh no, that's going to be further over on the political difficulty scale. So everyone, as they look at their things they have experience with, they're moving them further and further to the right of our scale. And there's nothing in the lower left-hand corner, which is maybe a statement about why we keep talking about these issues.
Great. Well, I think that is all the time we have. Unfortunately, I think we could talk about this stuff, you know, for 2 hours. But I really want to thank all three of you for sharing your insights. I think you've brought, you know, so much expertise and so much great perspective to this conversation. And I hope everybody got as much out of it as I did. So with that, we'll wrap it up. And thanks everyone for tuning in.
Many thanks to you.